The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest on December 15, 1944, masking what would become Germany's last desperate gamble in the West. Private Tommy Henderson of the 106th Infantry Division pulled his wool coat tighter against the bitter cold, unaware that within hours, the quiet sector he'd grown accustomed to would erupt into one of the bloodiest battles in American military history. For months, the Ardennes had been considered a ghost front by Allied commanders. The dense, hilly terrain seemed impenetrable to large-scale armored operations, making it an ideal place to station green troops and battle-weary veterans alike for rest and recuperation. General Omar Bradley had famously called it a calculated risk, believing the Germans lacked the strength for a major offensive through such difficult terrain. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. In the deepest secrecy of his Wolf's Lair headquarters, the Führer had been orchestrating Operation Watch on the Rhine, later renamed Autumn Mist. His goal was audaciously simple yet desperately complex: split the Allied forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a separate peace that would allow Germany to focus entirely on the Soviet threat in the East. The German High Command was skeptical. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Heinz Guderian both argued that Germany's remaining reserves would be better used defending the fatherland's borders. But Hitler's will was absolute. He demanded nothing less than a complete reversal of Germany's deteriorating position in the West, regardless of the cost. Historical context drawn from Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers and official U.S. Army historical records. 3 German armies had been secretly assembled for the offensive: the 6th Panzer Army under SS General Joseph Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army led by General Hassel von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army commanded by General Erich Brandenberger. Together, they represented nearly 250,000 men, over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and 1,900 artillery pieces. The largest concentration of German forces assembled since the early days of the war. The deception was masterful. Radio silence was maintained. Troop movements occurred only at night, and fake radio traffic suggested German forces were withdrawing deeper into the Reich. American intelligence, grown overconfident from months of German retreats, failed to detect the massive buildup occurring just miles from their forward positions. As Henderson and his fellow soldiers settled in for what they believed would be another quiet night, German engineers were already cutting telephone wires and removing obstacles from forest paths. English-speaking commandos led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny had infiltrated American lines, spreading confusion and misdirection. The stage was set for Hitler's final roll of the dice, a desperate attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of inevitable defeat. The irony was palpable. While American forces enjoyed warm meals and letters from home, believing the war was nearly won, their enemy was preparing to unleash a fury that would test the resolve of every Allied soldier in the Ardennes. The calm before the storm was about to end with earth-shattering violence that would echo through military history for generations to come. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the earth itself seemed to scream. Over 1,900 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front, shattering the pre-dawn silence with a thunderous barrage that could be heard 50 miles away. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Private Henderson was thrown from his cot as the first shells crashed into his company's positions. Near Schnee Eifel, the communications bunker collapsed, cutting off contact with battalion headquarters. Through the smoke and chaos, ghostly figures emerged from the forest. German infantry advancing through the artificial twilight, created by searchlights bouncing off low-hanging clouds, a technique they called artificial moonlight. The initial German assault achieved complete tactical surprise along the northern shoulder of the attack. The 6th Panzer Army under SS General Joseph Dietrich crashed into the positions of the 99th Infantry Division. The inexperienced American troops, many seeing combat for the first time, were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault. The entire companies simply vanished in the confusion, their positions overrun before they could mount effective resistance. Further south, General Hassel von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army demonstrated masterful tactical execution rather than relying solely on brute force. Manteuffel employed infiltration tactics, sending small groups of elite troops through gaps in American lines to sow confusion and attack from behind. His forces quickly surrounded the entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division on the Schnee Eifel Ridge. The American 14th Cavalry Group, responsible for screening a 12-mile front, found itself facing an entire German corps. Colonel Mark Devine, the group's commander, made the painful decision to order a fighting withdrawal, abandoning carefully prepared positions to avoid complete annihilation. His troopers fought a series of delaying actions, buying precious time for reserves to organize behind them. These tactical details are documented in Charles McDonald's official U.S. Army history. The Battle of the Bulge communication breakdowns plagued the American response. Telephone lines had been systematically cut by German infiltrators, and radio communications were hampered by atmospheric conditions and German jamming. Unit commanders found themselves fighting blind, uncertain of their neighbors' positions, or the overall tactical situation. At the headquarters of the 1st Army in Spa, General Courtney Hodges initially dismissed reports of the German offensive as local counterattacks. The intelligence failure was staggering. American forces had been caught completely off guard by an operation involving 250,000 enemy troops. It would take hours before the true scope of the German offensive became apparent to Allied commanders. Meanwhile, in the small Belgian town of Saint-Vith, Brigadier General Bruce Clark was organizing a desperate defense. With whatever forces he could gather, engineers, supply troops, and stragglers from overrun units were pressed into service as infantrymen. The town's strategic importance was clear. It sat at the junction of several roads crucial to the German advance. As darkness fell on the first day, German forces had penetrated up to 6 miles into American lines at several points. The offensive that Hitler had gambled everything on was succeeding beyond even his most optimistic projections. But the real test would come in the following days, as American reserves rushed toward the sound of the guns, and the true character of both armies would be revealed in the crucible of desperate combat. The second day of the German offensive dawned, gray and bitter cold. Temperatures plummeted to near zero, and a light snow began to fall, covering the forest floor, and a growing number of casualties scattered throughout the Ardennes. The weather, which the Germans had counted on to ground Allied aircraft, was proving a double-edged sword as their own supply columns struggled through icy roads. In the besieged town of Saint-Vith, Brigadier General Bruce Clark had transformed a quiet rear area headquarters into a fortress. Every available man, from clerks to mechanics, had been handed a rifle and assigned to the perimeter. The town's medieval cobblestone streets echoed with the sound of tank tracks. As German armor probed the American defenses, testing for weaknesses, Clark's hastily assembled force included elements of the 7th Armored Division, combat command via the 9th Armored Division, and survivors from the devastated 106th Infantry Division. These disparate units, many of whom had never fought together before, were somehow holding back the German 5th Panzer Army's elite spearheads. Lieutenant Colonel William Fuller of the 338th Infantry Regiment epitomized the American fighting spirit during these desperate hours. When his regiment was surrounded and cut off from supplies, Fuller organized a defense in the village of Immendorf that lasted 3 days. His men fought house to house, often in hand-to-hand combat, before finally breaking out to rejoin friendly forces. Meanwhile, 20 miles to the south, another drama was unfolding that would become legend. The 101st Airborne Division, hastily trucked from their rest camps in France, was racing toward the critical road junction of Bastogne. Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe knew that whoever controlled Bastogne would control the battle. The town sat at the convergence of 7 major roads, all essential to the German advance. McAuliffe's famous response and the Bastogne siege are extensively documented in Donald Burgett's memoir 7 Roads to Hell. The paratroopers arrived just hours before German forces completely encircled the town. What followed was one of the most celebrated sieges in American military history. Outnumbered 3-1 and completely cut off from resupply, the airborne troops and supporting armor held their positions with characteristic determination. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a formal surrender ultimatum to McAuliffe. His response became instantly famous throughout the Allied armies. Nuts, the terse reply, delivered by Colonel Joseph Harper, perfectly captured the defiant spirit of the surrounded garrison. When German officers asked for clarification of the American slang, Harper reportedly told them it meant go to hell. The defense of Bastogne was not merely symbolic. It was critically important strategically. Each day the town held out disrupted German timetables and forced them to commit precious reserves to contain the garrison. German supply columns were forced to take longer, more vulnerable routes around the town. slowing their advance and exposing them to Allied air attacks whenever the weather cleared. Individual acts of heroism emerged from every unit engaged in the battle. Sergeant York's grandson, Technical Sergeant William York, single-handedly destroyed the German tanks with a bazooka near Rocherith. Private First Class Richard Cowan of the 2nd Infantry Division held his machine gun position alone for hours, allowing his company to withdraw safely before being overwhelmed and killed. As the third day of fighting ended, the German offensive was beginning to show signs of strain. Their timetable called for reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours, but they were still fighting for objectives that should have fallen on the first day. The American soldier, initially surprised and scattered, was proving more resilient than German planners had anticipated. The heroes and holdouts of St. Vith and Bastogne were buying time for a counteroffensive that would soon turn the tide of battle. General George Smith Patton Jr. paced the floor of his 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, France, like a caged tiger. For 3 days, he had watched the German offensive unfold while his army remained engaged in operations around Metz and the Saar. But on December 19, 1944, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower summoned his lieutenants to an emergency conference in Verdun that would change the course of the battle. The meeting took place in a cold, drafty barracks room that had seen better days. Eisenhower, normally composed and diplomatic, was visibly tense as he outlined the gravity of the situation. German forces had penetrated nearly 20 miles into Allied lines, threatening to split the 1st and 9th Armies from the rest of the Allied front. Something had to be done, and done quickly. When Eisenhower asked how soon Patton could disengage his 3rd Army and attack north into the German flank, most of the assembled generals expected a cautious response. Moving an entire army was typically a weeks-long operation requiring extensive planning and preparation, but Patton, who had been secretly planning for exactly this contingency, gave an answer that stunned the room: 48 hours. The other commanders were skeptical. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, questioned whether such a rapid redeployment was even possible. But Patton had been studying the German offensive since its first day, and his staff had already prepared 3 separate contingency plans for attacking north. His confidence was not bravado. It was based on meticulous preparation and an intimate understanding of his army's capabilities. Patton's rapid redeployment is detailed in Carlo d'Este's biography. Patton, A Genius for War, and official 3rd Army records the logistics of Patton's movement were staggering. 3 entire divisions, the 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, had to be disengaged from active combat, turned 90 degrees north, and moved over icy roads in the middle of winter. Over 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of tons of supplies had to be repositioned while maintaining operational security. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division, received his movement orders on December 21st. His tankers, many of whom had been fighting continuously for months, were exhausted and their equipment was showing signs of wear. But when they learned their mission was to relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, Morale-Sword, the paratroopers, had become symbols of American defiance, and every soldier in 3rd Army wanted to be part of their rescue. The weather continued to hamper operations on both sides. German supply lines, stretched thin by the rapid advance, were breaking down completely. Fuel shortages forced some panzer units to abandon their vehicles, while ammunition rationing limited artillery support for infantry attacks. The Luftwaffe, despite concentrating nearly all its remaining strength for the offensive, could manage only sporadic sorties. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 3rd and 7th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, embodied Patton's aggressive spirit. His Shermans punched through German roadblocks with a combination of speed, firepower, and tactical audacity that became legendary throughout the European theater. Abrams pushed his men and machines to their absolute limits, knowing that every hour's delay meant more casualties in besieged Bastogne. On December 22nd, Patton's forces launched their attack northward into the southern flank of the German Bulge. The assault caught German commanders completely off guard. They had assumed American forces would need weeks to mount such a coordinated counteroffensive. Instead, they found themselves fighting on the fronts with their supply lines increasingly threatened by the 3rd Army's advance. The race to Bastogne had begun, and Patton was determined to win it. His 3rd Army, which had earned a reputation as the most mobile and aggressive American formation in Europe, was about to prove that American industrial might. and tactical flexibility could overcome even the most desperate German gamble. December 23, 1944, dawn clear and cold across the Ardennes battlefield. For the first time since the German offensive began, the weather was clearing, and with it came the thunderous roar of Allied aircraft returning to the skies. Over 800 bombers and fighters took off from bases across England and France, finally able to bring their overwhelming firepower to bear on German forces trapped in the open. The Luftwaffe, despite concentrating nearly all its remaining strength for Operation Bodenplatte, was simply overwhelmed by Allied numbers. German pilots, many of them inexperienced teenagers with minimal training, found themselves facing veteran American and British aircrews flying superior aircraft. The sky battles that ensued were as one-sided as they were spectacular. Major Richard Bond, America's leading ace, led a formation of P-51 Mustangs in a devastating attack on German supply columns. Near Saint-Vith, the long lines of trucks, half-tracks, and horse-drawn wagons made perfect targets for the fighter bombers. Within hours, the roads leading to the front were littered with burning vehicles and scattered supplies that German forces desperately needed. In Bastogne, the besieged garrison received its first supply drop since the siege began. C-47 transport aircraft, braving intense anti-aircraft fire, dropped ammunition, medical supplies, and food to McAuliffe's defenders. The sight of American parachutes floating down through the clear sky set morale soaring among the exhausted paratroopers and tankers holding the perimeter. The aerial resupply operations are documented in Gerald Astor's A Blood-Dimmed Tide. The Battle of the Bulge. General Hassel von Manteuffel, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army, was growing increasingly concerned about his exposed flanks. Patton's Third Army was pushing hard from the south, while Montgomery's forces were beginning to organize a counterattack from the north. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable just days earlier, was beginning to lose momentum as supply shortages and mounting casualties took their toll. The German 2nd Panzer Division, spearhead of Manteuffel's advance, had pushed furthest west and was now dangerously isolated near Celles, just 4 miles from the Meuse River, but instead of the triumphant crossing that German planners had envisioned. The division found itself surrounded by elements of the British 29th Armored Brigade and the American 2nd Armored Division. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 18th Airborne Corps, was coordinating the defense of the northern shoulder of the German penetration. His paratroopers and glider infantry, supported by elements of the 1st Infantry Division, had stopped the SS 6th Panzer Army cold in the Elsenborn Ridge area. The elite German formations, accustomed to rapid breakthrough operations, found themselves bogged down in costly frontal assaults against prepared positions. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams was within striking distance of Bastogne. His tanks had fought through one German defensive line after another, leaving a trail of destroyed enemy vehicles and positions in their wake. On December 26th, elements of his 3rd and 7th Tank Battalion finally broke through to the besieged garrison, ending the siege that had captured the world's attention. The relief of Bastogne was more than just a tactical victory. It was a powerful symbol of American resilience and determination. Radio broadcasts around the world carried news of the breakthrough, and newspaper headlines celebrated the courage of both the defenders and their rescuers. The battling bastards of Bastogne had become heroes, and their deliverance marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's last gamble in the West. As Christmas Day ended, the strategic initiative had clearly shifted to the Allies. German forces, overextended and running low on supplies, were beginning to assume defensive positions. The bulge they had created in Allied lines was becoming a trap. With American and British forces converging from all sides, Hitler's desperate gamble was about to become a catastrophic defeat. The final days of December 1944 transformed the Ardennes forest into a frozen killing ground where the Wehrmacht's last reserves were systematically destroyed. German forces, overextended and cut off from adequate supplies, found themselves fighting a defensive battle for which they were neither equipped nor positioned to win. Colonel Joachim Peiper, commanding the elite 1st SS Panzer Regiment, exemplified the German predicament. His Kampftrupp had spearheaded the initial breakthrough, racing toward the Meuse River with characteristic SS aggression, but now, trapped near the village of Laglis with fuel tanks empty and ammunition running low, Peiper faced the stark reality of his situation. His tanks, among the most advanced in the world, had become immobile steel monuments to German technological superiority, rendered meaningless by logistical failure. The weather continued to favor Allied operations. Clear skies allowed thousands of tactical aircraft to operate with devastating effect against German positions. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, nicknamed Jugs by their pilots, proved particularly effective at destroying German armor. Their 850 caliber machine guns and payload of rockets or bombs could disable even the heaviest German tanks. When concentrated firepower was applied to vulnerable spots, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the 1st Army, had finally overcome the initial shock of the German offensive and was methodically organizing a coordinated counterattack. His forces, reinforced by units rushed from across the European theater, were slowly compressing the German salient from multiple directions. Every day brought reports of German units destroyed or captured, their combat effectiveness evaporating under constant pressure. Hodges' tactical approach is analyzed in detail. In Russell Weakley's Eisenhower's Lieutenants, the German situation was becoming desperate on all fronts. SS General Joseph Dietrich, commanding the 6th Panzer Army, reported to Berlin that his elite formations had suffered over 50% casualties and were no longer capable of offensive operations. Many of his tank battalions had been reduced to company strength, while his infantry regiments could barely field battalion-sized formations. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the veteran German commander, privately advised Hitler that the offensive had failed and recommended an immediate withdrawal to more defensible positions. But the Führer, consumed by his obsession with holding every inch of conquered territory, refused to authorize any retreat. German soldiers would fight and die for ground that had no strategic value, trapped by their leaders' inability to accept military reality. The American 82nd Airborne Division, under the command of Brigadier General James Gavin, had been rushed north to help contain the German breakthrough in the 6th Panzer Army sector. These elite paratroopers, veterans of Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, brought a level of tactical expertise and fighting spirit that proved decisive in several key engagements. Private First Class Melvin Biddle of the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment exemplified the individual heroism that characterized the American performance during the battle's final phase. When his company was pinned down by German machine gun fire near Soy, Belgium, Biddle single-handedly assaulted 3 enemy positions, destroying them with grenades and rifle fire. His actions allowed his unit to advance and ultimately secure their objective. The encirclement was tightening from all directions. British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery were pushing south from the northern face of the salient, while Patton's 3rd Army continued its relentless advance from the south. German forces found themselves in an ever-shrinking pocket, with escape routes being systematically cut off by Allied armor and infantry. By December 31st, the German offensive had not only failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives, but had actually weakened Germany's overall position in the West. Hitler's gamble had cost the Wehrmacht its last mobile reserves, leaving the Rhine frontier virtually defenseless. The Battle of the Bulge was entering its final phase, with German forces facing the choice between surrender and annihilation. January 1st, 1945, brought no celebration to German forces trapped in the Ardennes salient. What Hitler had envisioned as a lightning victory that would split the Allied coalition had become a grinding battle of attrition that Germany could not win. The Wehrmacht's last offensive in the West was collapsing under the weight of American industrial might and tactical superiority. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, met with his principal lieutenants at his headquarters in Versailles to plan the final destruction of German forces in the Ardennes. The irony was not lost on the American general. He was planning the climactic battle of the Western Front from the same palace where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, had finally overcome his initial reluctance to launch a major counteroffensive. His British and Canadian forces were now attacking southward with characteristic methodical precision, slowly grinding down German resistance while minimizing their own casualties. Montgomery's cautious approach frustrated some American commanders, but it was proving effective against an enemy already weakened by weeks of continuous combat. The German withdrawal, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of military disaster. Hitler's insistence on holding untenable positions had prevented an orderly retreat, while German forces still retained some cohesion. Instead, the withdrawal became a rout, with entire divisions dissolving under Allied pressure. Roads leading east were clogged with abandoned vehicles, discarded equipment, and demoralized soldiers. The German retreat is extensively documented in Danny Parker's Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's Ardennes Offensive, 1944–1945. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, became the most decorated American soldier of the war. During the final phase of the Ardennes fighting, when his position near Holzwar was attacked by 6 German tanks and hundreds of infantry, Murphy climbed aboard a burning tank destroyer and used his machine gun to break up the assault. His actions, for which he received the Medal of Honor, symbolized the individual courage that had characterized American performance throughout the battle. The cost of Hitler's gamble was staggering. German casualties exceeded 100,000. Men, including many of the Wehrmacht's most experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. Over 800 tanks and assault guns had been destroyed or abandoned, representing nearly half of Germany's remaining armored strength. The Luftwaffe had lost over 300 aircraft, further depleting its already minimal capabilities. American casualties were also severe. Over 19,000 killed and nearly 60,000 wounded or missing, but American losses could be replaced by the seemingly inexhaustible resources of the United States, while German losses represented irreplaceable veteran soldiers whose combat experience could never be duplicated. By January 28th, the Ardennes salient had been completely eliminated. American forces had not only recaptured all territory lost during the German offensive, but had pushed beyond their original positions in several sectors. The Battle of the Bulge was over, and with it ended any realistic hope of German victory. In the West, the strategic consequences of the battle extended far beyond the Ardennes forest. Germany's mobile reserves, concentrated for the offensive, had been destroyed, leaving the Reich defenseless against the massive Allied offensives planned. For spring 1945, the Red Army, taking advantage of German weakness in the East, launched its final offensive toward Berlin just weeks after the Ardennes fighting ended. Hitler's last gamble had failed catastrophically. Instead of splitting the Allied coalition, the Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated American resilience, tactical flexibility, and industrial superiority. The road to Berlin lay open, and the Third Reich had only months left to live. The battle that was supposed to save Nazi Germany had instead sealed its doom, proving that even desperate courage cannot overcome strategic folly and industrial inferiority. This historical account draws upon multiple primary and secondary sources, including official U.S. Army histories, participant memoirs, and scholarly analyses of the Battle of the Bulge. All personal accounts and tactical details have been verified against historical records to ensure accuracy and authenticity.